Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. This is episode 242, isn't it? Well, that was a guess. Yeah, it's 242. Next week is a route review, and it looks like I have at least one or two routes lined up, people that want to have me look over their route. So, I'm looking forward to that, and I'm sure you guys are looking forward to a little bit of that as well. So, now that that's out of the way, the obligatory this footage is available in its non-condensed form in Under Construction, which will be coming out at the same time. And it has live commentary, it has questions and answers, it has me doing viewer request things, so check it out. And that's, if you're unfamiliar with that series, that's what that is. Just building the route. Of course, today we have a question, and the question is the continuation. We're almost done with the Converting Coaches series. We are 2 episodes away from it, not including this one. And this one is the hospital. So, this was not the last coach in the train, but it was the last coach in the train that usually had, or that was part of the main, what do you call it? The main living area. And the hospital wasn't really a living area, but there were residents of it from time to time, because there were, people got hurt. It was, I don't think that's something that I need to say, but it wasn't all rosy. It's, you take one bad tumble and you're out of commission for a few weeks. We had people laid up for, the hospital was a latecomer. And it actually it utilized a lot of machines, materials, and of course chemicals, drugs, that kind of stuff that we had to scavenge for. And some of the stuff went bad really quickly. The number one thing was, it had sort of a laboratory section where we could manufacture some basic stuff. We could manufacture penicillin, which that was a lifesaver for not only people on the train, but people elsewhere. And towards not the end of our run, but once we got that sort of in full swing, we ended up making a lot of money on it. If money trades, we ended up having a lot of bartering power, because we don't really think about how well off we are in terms of combating infection. In the modern era, we had access to penicillin and all sorts of other antibiotic drugs, which were, of course, harder to produce, but more potent or more widely usable. And when that went away, we sort of reverted back to a period where one bad cut that got infected could kill you. And you saw in a lot of places people reverting to this very old school, not witch doctoring medicine, but like almost Civil War era medicine, where it's like, oh, that's infected, we're gonna have to cut that off. So you saw an increase of people going around with one leg, one arm, just from getting injured doing normal things. And that was incredible. That was incredible, and not in a good way in the slightest. And so we would run into a lot of the towns, and one of the first things we'd ask is, okay, what have you got in the way of sick people? Let's see what we can do for them. And because we could make stuff, obviously it isn't that hard to make a splint or anything like that, but some very basic medications, especially things for pain or things for, what am I thinking of? Just general sickness? No. That doesn't mean much, but there are a few things we take for granted. Take an aspirin, or, whatever. Not an aspirin, what's the other one? Like an Alka-Seltzer or something. And, take one of those and you'll feel better. But when you don't have access to that kind of thing, and you're trying to get sort of maximum productivity out of a small town, out of a few people in a small town, being able to get a hold of something, at least to hold you over for a little while you're aching and paining, or, feeling nauseous from whatever was incredible. It was great. The other thing is we had to revert to some old school stuff in the hospital. But let's go over. The hospital was cleaned. It was cleaned very thoroughly, and then the floors were painted over with like a new layer of varnish, and the walls as best we could, and the windows were all most of them were actually sealed just to not let outside air in when we wanted it to, but we did have to leave some just in case you needed fresh air. There was, a fine line we had to walk with that, because you don't want to be bringing in outside junk. We did have plenty of, what do you call it? Plenty of something. I don't know, we had certain areas that were set up to do certain things. The one thing we didn't have right off, and this came later, like much too late in my opinion, because it was very simple, but was curtains in between the different beds. So there were, I think, 8, maybe 12 beds in total in that coach, and they all had a pretty good sized space between them, so that the nurse on staff or doctor on staff could navigate around the bed and get to you and whatever. And that, that was important, but there was a lot of wasted space there, and then we cordoned off like the back half of the coach for laboratory purposes and also for surgery. The beds were on rollers, but they were secured down when we were moving. So originally it was screwing them in, but that didn't work because when we had to move somebody on a whim that was no good, and also screwing and unscrewing kicked up a lot of sawdust and garbage like that, which we didn't want. So that went away fairly quickly. Instead, we started making these quick release bolt things, which basically we use door bolts, the ones that you slide. You'll see them on like bathroom doors and stuff, and we would have one down at each leg, and there were 4. Or we would do one like the ones in opposite corners. So we would do two. Now these weren't particularly hard to come by, so we usually did 4, but there were a couple beds that had 2 for a while. And these were the ones that were actually closest to the operating end of the car, because again, the beds would be, when you needed to operate on somebody, we only had so many beds. So we didn't have an operating bed necessarily. We did have an operating table if we needed to lay someone down on something hard. But for the most part, what you'd just do is you'd wheel someone in there and do what you need to do in there. The mattresses had these plastic covers on them because you didn't want to get blood in those mattresses or anything. And they were not exactly real good mattresses because they're hospital beds. This is crap that we stole from a hospital. Which, for the record, going in there to take this stuff was one of the creepiest things I've ever been a part of. Because it's a hospital. Obviously, hospitals were hotbeds for, like, patient zeros for certain areas. Our hospital, thankfully, was never, but we did have a few scares, and what we figure were close calls, where we weren't sure if, like, something was an actual zombie bite, and so we had to amputate anyways, and then just sort of hope and pray that the person didn't fall asleep and wake up in a few hours as a zombie. Now that was legitimately something that we had to worry about a lot, especially when we pulled people, or especially when we found people like trackside, not people that were members of the crew. Because people trackside, they would have reason to lie about, anyone would have reason to lie about being bitten. You wouldn't say, hey, I've been bitten, usually, if you want to be accepted. Although, if you can, again, amputate fast enough, which we had to do a lot of those, there was a decent chance that you would survive. just without whatever limb, whatever extremity got bitten. And usually it was a bite in the extremities. But this hospital, oh God, which one was it? It must have been... No, it was one that was very close to the railroad tracks in the Northeast. I don't remember. I've like blocked it out. It's out of my head because I don't really want to remember that much. But it was probably the creepiest / scariest thing I've ever done, because that hospital was definitely a patient zero location. There were patients strapped down that were undead, and they would shake their cots when you walked by. And we didn't want to waste ammo on them, but we did have to watch our backs just in case. Again, thankfully we never had a patient zero situation. Towards the end of it, we got a better idea of how long from a zombie bite you could last, with the amputation, etc. Like how recent it would have to be in order for you to have a good chance of survival. And generally, if we took a look at the bite and somebody was too far along, because you could tell a little bit, we just wouldn't let them on the train. And that's, kind of a heartless thing, but it was the thing that we had to do after we did have a couple close calls. Again, I say we never had a patient zero, but that's because the train never got infected totally. We did have a couple of instances where the person died, and we were watching on the monitor, and we sort of started to see the telltale signs. Like, the monitor won't work, but the zombie will start, like, moving a little before it's awake. And that was sort of our cue to, okay, let's untie this guy and boot him off the train, or, euthanize him even, which is what we would usually do if we weren't in too bad of a spot for ammo, etc. Not that we would actually use a firearm on him in there, but yeah, no, what am I saying? If we had a feeling there was a zombie, it was a procedure of destroy the head and then throw the body off the train so that you can't have him have the body infect anything. And because you can still become infected from one of those, it would have to come in contact with your bodily fluids, which is why the euthanasia process was something a little bit tricky sometimes, because you'd have to put a mask on and everything like that. But even if you got it in your eyes, you'd be in trouble. But that was that. We only had that a couple of times, and then we started to learn, and we started to be a little bit more of hardliners on letting people on the train when they are either acting shifty, where we figure they might be infected, or where it's clear that we can't do anything for them. If we were, I won't say more virtuous people, but if we were more of dreamers or willing to take more risks, we might have, sort of always gone with we'll try anything, we'll amputate it, we'll see what happens. But some people, you have a bite on, like, your abdomen, there's no way you're going to survive. The virus has probably already taken hold of you, and you're just not dead yet. So, the hospital was where all that went. And I'm sorry, I didn't really talk about the coach itself, but it was a very bare-bones kind of setup. We would use some machines. They were powered by electricity, so we didn't often use them. We had to do a lot of things manually, or with old-school methods. We were, we couldn't use electric thermometers more often than not, so we had to use glass ones. But that's just an example. But that laboratory in the back of that car saved our skin many, many times, and also it made us have much easier lives, and saved many, many lives in the course of its service. Now that now after the Zombie Train Incorporated, that car is like it's the equivalent of a hazmat area. It's equivalent of a Superfund site. Like that car has been taken out of the consist and needs to be cleaned badly if it's going to go on tour ever. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and next week is a route review, like I said. and I will see you next week. Trainman out.